All right. So, my name is Anand. I am going to talk to you about how do you really keep your cloud secure, right? So, how do you really keep your cloud secure is a question. Uh, Most of your CEOs are going to ask your CISOs or CIOs, right? And in a recent survey for CISOs and CIOs, what was the worst question that a CEO can ask their CISOs? Any guesses? How secure are we? That's the worst question. That was rated the worst question that a CEO can ask their CISOs, right? What would you do to tweak it? Is any question you'd like to tweak instead of how secure are we? Well, the second most, so the first number one right question was how mature is our security practice, right? Or how effective are we? Those are the two questions that they ask. So in the cloud world, you probably want to look at how secure, how secure are we is probably the wrong way to look at. How effective are we at security is the right question to ask your audience, right? So that's what we'll do, right? The second thing is I don't want to run through these are the 100 solutions that we have, these are the 100 solutions you want to buy, right? I want to run through, as a customer, I'm going to select a customer of ours, and as a customer, what was their security journey on AWS? That's what I'll talk about, right? What are the things that they did to secure the AWS infrastructure? How did they do it? And finally, we will talk about what products help them get there, right? So let's start off with this. How many of you have seen this page? Right, pretty much everyone. As soon as you log on to your AWS Management Console, there's a page that you see, right? You'll see all the products that AWS has, 100 plus services today that a customer can log in, sign on, start using, right? How many of you are worried of how secure they are? Or have you secured the basic principles of it? That's where the security journey starts on AWS, right? How do you really know what is your responsibility as a customer to secure this? This is a model that probably every one of you have seen. It's an AWS slide. Anything in orange at the bottom is responsibility of AWS, so security of the cloud. But security in the cloud, which is your responsibility as a customer using those products, right? So worry about what you're running on the cloud, how you're running on the cloud, and then securing those instances on the cloud. That's going to be your best practices, right? So that's basically the tenet of what I'm going to talk about. So what I'm going to talk to you about is, from a customer standpoint, what is their journey of securing their cloud infrastructure, right? So this is an AWS customer, and this is what they are, right? They have 100 plus accounts that they have in the organization, 100 plus teams, based on organization structure that's at least 3 levels deep. They have 500 plus accounts on AWS today. They're using in this AWS in 15 different regions. And in terms of services on AWS, they're consuming more than 30 services of AWS today, right? Across those services, thousands of resources. So that's the level of scale that they have on AWS, and they are now implemented all the security best practices that they want with their infrastructure, and they have grown in that, right? So let's look at what they did in terms of securing their cloud infrastructure, right? So before we go there, they also talked about how they want to really define their DevSec Ops approach. This is very important when you're trying to secure cloud, right? What is your approach to using the cloud to start with? And that's the number one thing that you want to define. So the first one is the AWS operations itself. That typically you divide this into 3 phases, but this is their approach, okay? Their slide, their approach. Typically starts with AWS operations. What's AWS operations? This basically is all cloud infrastructure that you're going to use on AWS. So look at your EC2 instances, look at containers that you're running, data, storage, applications. So this is everything related to AWS infrastructure that you're going to stand up and that you're going to use, right? Now within that, there's basic security principles that you want to put in place. So the basic security principles are around inventories, knowing what's running on the cloud, knowing monitoring and reporting. So you're monitoring who's using what in there. Set up your security parameters in terms of who's accessing it and who has access to those. So those are basic access controls. And then you have enforcement in place on things that people can do on AWS infrastructure. So that's your AWS infrastructure operations. Now on top of this, you're going to start building your service layers, right? The service layer basically is, as cloud platform engineers, what are the services that you want to give your organization, right? And that's what they built. So they started by building common microservices that they want to offer, using which they build their own product services. So you start building their own products on top of it that you want to create a offering. Typically, this is where you have your apps that you want to provide within your organization. So using containers, using pods, build apps, and roll that out in your organization. Now, from an app perspective, as you're building those apps, you want to build security in the layers as well, right? So there comes securing an image release pipeline, securing an inventory for software packages, doing privilege access management. These are all the layers that come into this service offering, right? That's the second layer. Now, these two together are more of preemptive security, right? More about before I put things in production, before I use, these are all the security controls I want to put in place. Last one is more the reactive one. No matter how secure you get here, you want to ensure that from a reactive perspective, you have things in place to monitor for any incidents that happen. So that's where you have monitoring network traffic, monitoring your AWS resources, monitoring your cluster resources and applications, and finally setting up alerts, notifications, and following up on how to really ensure that as incidents happens, as alerts are tracked, you want to put an incident response program in place so you can react to it quickly, right? So that's the typical DevSec Ops approach that I've seen this customer take, and that's why I wanted to put it out here. So that's a typical practice. Now going on to their journey of securing their AWS infrastructure, right? It's a 5-step program. So step number 1, obviously, is start with discovery. So understand what exists in your environment and start discovering what's there on it, right? So step number 1, understand who's using your cloud services, who's using cloud resources, and identify where they are, right? So talk about, I logged in, I created an instance in North Virginia, I created an instance in Australia. From a visibility perspective, you need to know where they're running, right? That's step number 1. Second thing is from a workload and containers perspective, what's running on your cloud? Who's running containers? What are they running on? Do I know what application is hosted on each of those containers? That's the second principle. Third one is who can access this? Now you have things running on the cloud, but at the second instance, you need to know who's having access to it, right? So for any example is I have root privileges, and for some reason, someone else got to know my password, they suddenly have access to all of these resources now, right? So who really has access to those resources? What is their access level? Do they have root privileges, admin access, or have you curtailed them down using an IAM role? That's important. So having visibility into that. And finally is knowing if there's any shadow IT accounts or unsanctioned accounts in your environment, right? So I, as a user, have a credit card. I can swipe it, and I can stand up my own instances on the cloud. So knowing those kind of rogue users or shady IT users. All of this together comes under that visibility bucket, and you want to know what's running and who's running what, right? That's step number 1, and that's how you want to gain visibility into your resources. Second, once you know what's running and how it's running, you want to set up a baseline posture, right? So the baseline posture basically is knowing at any given point of time what's running and is it secure, right? Secure from basic tenets like CIS benchmark, your own internal best practices. You may say encrypt everything that's stored in S3 bucket, right? IAM roles as they're given, no one should have root access or pure root access. Security groups should not allow SSH or RDP from 0.0.0. Those are certain best practices that you want to put in place. So that's your baseline, they're building to your baseline, right? Now, for this, obviously Symantec did provide out-of-the-box policies, but they didn't want to use that. They had their own custom gold standard, so they had to create their own gold standard within the product. They liked it, and they started using that. Once you start monitoring for baseline changes, obviously the next thing is as soon as you find something broken or as soon as you find something that's missing, you want to automatically fix it. That's the second most important part. So for example, you found that someone's enabled port 22, right? You immediately want to fix it. So you want to put an automated remediation program in place for certain things. In this case, what they did was they enabled auto remediation for S3 buckets, security groups and IAM roles and users. Everything else went into ServiceNow. So they just ticketed it. So anything that's really critical was auto-fixed. Anything that's not that critical can go into a ticket. You have their due diligence to look after ticketing. That's the process that they did, right? So you want to identify misconfigurations, fix it. what advantage they got this was they also had baseline in place, right? So what happened was, yesterday they had a certain baseline practice or baseline infrastructure with security best practices. Today, they suddenly see a lot of red alerts, right? Compare the two instances and tell what really changed. That was the most critical part. That's why the baselining is very important. So give a time-based analysis of what changed, and then you can track who changed it to capture the rogue account. That's the most important part of this analysis, right? So step number 2, securing your baseline, right? Step number 3 is around protecting your workloads and containers. So now you have your base control plane covered. They moved into control the workloads and the container itself. So from a workload perspective, obviously they started off by looking at, they looked at automating agent deployment in this case, but eventually they wanted, how can I really secure my instances, right? Securing instances basically is locking it down. So how do I really lock it down? Make it immutable. Right? Immutability of the host, immutability of containers. Those are the two principles on which they strived on. But to do that, obviously, the first thing they started off with deploying malware detection policies on ensure that there's nothing that's rogue that's running on all my endpoints and servers. That's the first one. The second thing that they did was around app control and app isolation. That basically is reducing your threat attack surface into every instances. So for that, they looked at unauthorized apps. So they look at ensuring only trusted apps or sanctioned apps were allowed to run on any instance. So that's app isolation. And finally, looking at preventing unauthorized access using those apps. So app isolation, app prevention, those are the two technologies that they use. So number 1, as I said, prevent unauthorized app from running. Second, once you know that an app is running, don't allow it to do anything other than what it's allowed to do. Right? So blocking unnecessary behavior. That's what they put into place. Those are the two technologies that they use from the instance side. When they came to the container side, right, from a container perspective, they look at, these are the 10 threat vectors that are from a container perspective that can come into me, and I want to protect myself against, right? So right from building a container image, so integrated into Jenkins, and ensuring that no vulnerabilities are brought into container images. As soon as you find vulnerabilities, kill the image build. Don't allow it to build. Once you know that, in your CI/CD deployment pipeline, ensure that only images that are certified are allowed to be deployed, right? So whitelisting, blacklisting of images, you can whitelist, blacklist, but what they decided was only sanctioned images which are free of vulnerabilities are allowed to be deployed. Once they're deployed, since you know what applications are running, you know how best to monitor the traffic between those containers, right? Container is going to interact with other containers, with databases, everything. Monitor traffic between those containers, ensuring it's only necessary behavior that happens. Anything that's anomalous, chop it. Don't allow it to happen. So you ensure that the container traffic, container usage is done the right way, right? And finally, all of this resulted in container immutability. So going back to the initial philosophy I told, right, they eventually want to make the workloads and the containers immutable, which basically is no one can change anything on it once it's running. That's what they wanted to achieve. That's the different steps that they took to achieve that, right? So that's the third one. Now we looked at control plane, we looked at the workloads, we looked at instances and this. The fourth step is around storage, right? And if you look at storage, this is the number one challenge. If you talk to Gartner, talk to any of the analysts, right, they'll tell you 90% of the breaches that happen on AWS or anywhere else is because of storage and misconfigured storage buckets, right? So from a storage perspective, obviously, like we started with discovery of your control plane, they started by implementing discovery of all storage elements that are there in your environment. So go out and discover any storage bucket that's spun up, right? Once you do that, the second thing they said was ensure that all the buckets and objects inside buckets are following the best practices. So what do I really mean by best practices here? Typically, is going to be, if I look at just storage, it's going to be who has access to it, from where are they having access to it, is it encrypted? Those are the three things you're going to look at. But when you look at objects, right, within the objects, you also have to look at who has access to individual objects. Are they encrypted in it? And finally, is there any malware present in those objects, right? Very important to do that. So that's where they brought in the visibility and security of the buckets and objects. And once you've discovered malware, right, you basically want to continuously audit those buckets for three things. One, who's writing into it? So is the right user writing into it? What are they writing? So are they writing malware? Are they writing PII data that should be really critical and you want to monitor it? And finally, who's moving data from where to where. If you're moving a data from a sanctioned bucket to an unsanctioned bucket, you're doing something wrong within your organization, right? So you want to ensure that you're monitoring on who's moving data in and out as well. And finally, obviously, I talked about the critical data. Based on the criticality of data, they determine which bucket should I really be looking at to protect first, right? So that's the basic philosophies that they put into the storage bucket. Within storage bucket, as I said, at 90% of threats and that have happened or data breaches that have happened in the past have happened because of misconfigured storage buckets. Of those 90 buckets, 90%, 70% were because there was malware in it. Someone stored malware in it, got access into your data, and they took it off. That's why this is very important for their perspective, right? Final step, once you've secured all of those instances, containers, buckets, and your control plane, the final thing is how do I really ensure that this is a continuous process, right? From continuous maintaining, achieving compliance, one, set up alerts and notifications. So they set up alerts and notifications in the organization. Anything, something is out of deviant, raise an alert for me. That's the first thing that they did. Second thing, they said all events are rolled up into Splunk, right? It can be any SIEM tool, but in this case, they wanted Splunk. That's why it was rolled up into Splunk, so they did that. Third thing, they put user behavior policies in place. So knowing what a good user does, knowing what a bad user does. Rating the user on how risky he is to your organization. You can say this user is risky to my organization, so prevent him from doing anything in my cloud infrastructure. You can fine-tune those policies as the user behavior changes, and then say, conditionally allow him only to do X, but don't allow him to do Y, right? So you can have conditional policies for workload, the user behavior analytics, right? Finally, workload policies are tuned. As you add more applications in your workloads, you want to fine-tune those your policies to ensure that those applications are taken into consideration, and you're protecting those new applications as they're created as well, right? So that's an ongoing principle. And then finally, they wanted to do PCI and SOC2 compliance, using all the policies across all the products, have a single pane of glass to show them PCI and SOC2 compliance. That's effectively what they implemented. Now, all of this was implemented by using different Symantec products that act as a single platform together, right? So how did they do this? So we started with this on what are the different areas of AWS that you start off that you want to protect with, right? So started with cloud workload protection that looks at your operating system, network, firewall configurations, and applications that are running it. So that's one layer of security, right? A second layer of security comes from cloud workload assurance that looks at your platform, looks at identity access management, and ensures that the control plane is secured the right way, right? And then the third and fourth pieces come together. We have cloud workload protection for storage that looks at your customer data that's stored in S3 buckets, and you're ensuring that all of that's protected. CASB or Cloud SOC comes in, integrates with the APIs through your infrastructure, and ensures that all users are doing the right thing. So user behavior monitoring. Risky user, don't allow them to access control. These are the 4 products. That's how they secure your basic building blocks of AWS or IaaS infrastructure, right? So how does Symantec overall secure AWS journey? That's a single slide that talks about it, right? So start off with any pillar. You can start with any of those boxes, and they will solve the overall journey for you, right? So go one by one, look at access, right? You start by ensuring you know what applications you're running, so you know what applications are, and you start by telling user X only can access application Y, right? So you can put in security measures from an application perspective, application granularity, that allows you to prevent people from accessing applications or allows them to access applications. That's the first basic security controls. Then you do from a building perspective. That's where cloud workload protection comes in. So you talked about the workload security, you talked about storage protection, and we talked about the container security. All of that is the building blocks that come from cloud workload protection, allows you to harden your cloud infrastructure. So nothing can change. That's where that comes from. Then you go into comply, which is cloud workload assurance, where looking at your control plane, knowing what's running on your cloud infrastructure, you want to ensure that you're following best practices, but at the same time also able to generate compliance reports on a live basis, right? So typically when we talk about compliance in the cloud, right, in the old days, you could have a pen and paper exercise. You have an Excel sheet which has a bunch of questions. do I do this, do I do this, do I do this, here's the evidence, that's possible. In the cloud, things are changing every second. You need to think of compliance in a little bit different way. That's why things like cloud workload assurance exist today, where for the live compliance, for dynamic compliance, you need tools that monitor your infrastructure on an ongoing basis to provide evidence. And finally, you have CloudSOC or CASB that protects your sensitive data from exposure and allows user behavior and user monitoring within your cloud resources, right? So this together brings the AWS security journey from Symantec. If you want to learn more about any of these products, we have our booth, which is 725. Come there, you'll learn more about all these products and tools and technologies, and we'll be happy to share any details about those. Right? So with that, I'll pause for any questions, comments.